Okay, the agri-demand curve can shift left or right. Remember that agri-demand is composed of consumption plus investment, government purchase plus net exports. Now, these were the four components of gross domestic product, but that was kind of after the fact. So it was like GDP last year. Here, what we're looking at is planned purchases for next year. So agri-demand is the concept of what will happen in the future. And we refer to this agri-demand as a curve. We'll see this. And it can shift left and right. Now, here we've got an example of the curve itself. And it's this kind of greenish color. It can go to the left or right depending on different fiscal policies and shocks. The term that we generally refer to as a shock is meaning a positive shock would mean the AD curve shifts to the right. A negative shock would mean it goes to the left. What we do mean by a shock? We mean something random, unexpected. I'm going to show you some examples in this lecture. In addition to this, we can have policies, either fiscal policy or monetary policy that could also shift it left to right. We refer to an expansionary policy as for the agri-demand curve shifting to the right, or a contraction, or I sometimes say restrictive policy, which will shift it to the left. A policy is something deliberate, where the government is saying that it wants to do something, it has an intention of doing so. There's a distinction between a policy and a shock, macro shock. Recall that in Canada, fiscal policy is controlled by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance through the government budget. That means government purchase and taxes. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is controlled by the Bank of Canada, the central bank that prints our money and uses it. So we're going to be looking at fiscal policy in this. We'll look at monetary policy later. And recall, too, that fiscal policy changes in government purchases or changes in taxes. Monetary policy is a change in the money, so printing of money supply. And finally, bond market can be either the fiscal policy or monetary policy. It means the Bank of Canada or the Minister of Finance can intervene in the bond market. Quick review. Okay, so let's take some example of two shocks, a negative shock and a positive shock, and see how they would work through aggregate demand. So start with a very easy example. Obvious one is negative shock of this COVID pandemic. Keep in mind that any kind of macroeconomic shock has to work through one of these four variables here. So in this case, it's fair to say that consumption has decreased, largely because people are not going out to stores and shops. It's true they're buying online, but they're not going to restaurants nearly as much as before. And foreigners are obviously not coming here. Foreign tourists, Americans purchasing things from us. They continue to purchase things. Trucks are crossing the border, but not to the same degree as before. Now, investment, on the other hand, if you look carefully, you'll notice still a lot of construction building going on in Canada, Montreal. And in fact, building materials, the price has gone up. So it appears that there's a lot of building. So investment probably hasn't been affected. Government purchases, we'll look at this later, but that would be part of fiscal policy. In any event, the result is we can say that consumption has gone down. Probably net exports have gone down, and the effect of this, the agri-demand has shifted. The agri-demand curve has shifted to the left. So we can see this here is the agri-demand going from 1 to 2, a leftward shift. Now, a positive shock. Well, here's an example. The Chinese economy grew very rapidly in the 1990s and the year 2000, so a 20-year period. It's still growing, grew very quickly. But this had a huge impact on Canada because, of course, we produce a lot of natural resources. The Chinese economy has a lot of people working, but it doesn't have the same kinds of resources. So as a result, the Chinese economy was purchasing many products, particularly from like Canada, Australia, Africa. And this resulted in a positive shock for us, and in this case it was our net exports of natural resources that we were sending to China. And so this poses actually a kind of a macroeconomic, I wouldn't say problem, but it poses a macroeconomic difficulty for the Canadian macroeconomic policies in this time period of 1990s, 2000. Again, it was unexpected. And at the same time, nobody knew how long this growth would continue. It's carried on now. So anyway, this is an example of a positive economic shock where the agri-demand curve would shift to the right. So let's take a look at an example of fiscal policy now. And there's going to be two ways in which the government can, this means the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance can apply an expansionary fiscal policy. First, an easy one is simply to increase government purchases. So if they do this, clearly G increases and the agri-demand curve will shift to the right. Here we can see it like this. It poses a problem, though, is it because the government at the same time would have to pay for these government purchases. So go back to the government budget constraint. If we ignore the possibility of printing money, because we're only looking at fiscal policy here, we're going to say that the government sells bonds. Let's say it doesn't affect taxes. So if the government sells bonds, it means the government budget deficit increases, government debt will increase. But in this Keynesian view, and I want to make a point here that the macroeconomic model, because it was invented by Keynes, is sometimes referred to as a Keynesian model. But Keynes also used his model to make prescriptions for government. And so in this Keynesian view, the use of the model, if you will, bonds have no effect on people. They don't affect people's behavior. So the only result is that the government increase purchases pushes the aggregate demand curve to the right. Other economists, I wouldn't say criticize Keynes, but they say, well, we have to look at this a little bit more carefully. What effect does this sale of bonds, how does that affect people's behavior? Now people own the bonds, they can't purchase as much consumption as before because they're saving. I won't get into the debate, but I'll just use the Keynesian view here because it keeps it simple, is that the sale of bonds has no other effect on people. There's another way that the government could achieve the same goal, and that would be to cut taxes. If the government cuts taxes, well, that would lead to higher income. Well, it was specifically higher disposable income. So we refer to disposable income as being like net income or income after taxes. Keep in mind, too, that this would mean that the government would have a larger budget deficit because it doesn't have the same revenues as before. I'm assuming the government spending, G, stays constant. Now, which variable now will be affected? And again, we have to look at one of these four here. And the idea is likely that it would be consumption. If the government cuts taxes, means people's disposable income increases, so they're more likely to purchase more things. And so consumption would go up, and the aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. So we have another example of a positive, or rather an expansionary fiscal policy. So two ways. The government can do it either directly by purchasing, or it can cut taxes and lead to higher consumption. And of course, then it becomes a political issue about which policy should be pursued. Some governments would prefer to increase government spending, buying more services for the population. Other governments would say, no, it's better to cut taxes and leave the money in people's hands. But they both achieve, from a macroeconomic standpoint, they both achieve the same goal of having an expansionary fiscal policy. I want to take a little quick glance at this idea, though, of a government cut in taxes. And it also illustrates an important concept in economics about the idea of saving versus consumption. Just imagine that your family you win a lottery, let's say $500,000 or $1 million. You win $1 million in the lottery. What would you do with this money? Let's see how economists view this kind of question. What would you do with $1 million? Would you spend it all? On a world cruise with your friends and then come back with nothing next year? Or would you save it? So have a world cruise, or would you, say, buy a house and pay down your mortgage? Economists generally think that if you were to win a lottery, you probably wouldn't do this. You'd be more likely to do this. And the reason being is that you're not likely to win a lottery every year. You know that it's a one-off event. Now, keep in mind, too, when you say buy a house, that's not consumption. It means, or even pay down your mortgage is not consumption. Because, in effect, you're saving because you're delaying your consumption. You're really saving for future consumption. You can use the house this year, next year, the year after, and so on and so forth. So this is an example of what we mean by saving, and then it becomes what would be considered investment. Now, if you think of, often people say, I'm going to invest in the stock market, buy shares or something, but it's the same effect. The reason you're doing this is because you want to delay your consumption and have it for the future. Now, if on the other hand, you were to get a promotion, what would you do with the money here? Well, economists generally believe that you would probably spend it now, this promotion, this extra money you're going to receive. And the reason being is that you'd be able to have that money every year forever. So you can change your lifestyle immediately. This is relevant for a tax cut because if the tax cut is perceived as temporary, meaning you say it's only this year, or you receive like a CERB payment, it's a one-off thing, then you're probably likely to treat it like a lottery and save most of it. Uh, so sometimes economists have suggested that if you're going to use the tax cut method to have expansionary fiscal policy, it's very important to tell people that this is a permanent change and that it's going to result not just in tax cut this year, but for the next 10, 15, 20 years, something like that. It also raises an interesting point, is that from the Keynesian perspective, is that if a person chooses to save something, and it has no effect on aggregate demand, and as a result, the aggregate, and there's no fiscal policy, there's no change in the aggregate demand. So it's only if this tax cut has an effect through consumption that it will show up in aggregate demand. This is often referred to as meaning that Keynes, and it's true, the Keynesian model, and particularly the use of the Keynesian model in a Keynesian sense, is a very short run. So we're only looking at changes in the aggregate demand curve to see how they affect the economy. Another economist, Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, who's Austrian, he would argue that saving actually is good. Because it shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right because it adds to our physical capital stock. And China is a very good example of this. The Chinese savings rates are extremely high, and this explains in large part why the Chinese economy has grown so quickly from, say, the 1990s until now. But keep in mind that John Maynard Keynes, his macroeconomic models used in a very short-run sense for what's going to happen in the next year to deal with a particular shock of some sort. Whereas we've already seen this. You could use the model in a long-run sense, but of course then it's a different use of the model. I want to just quickly look at the opposite of expansionary fiscal policy, contractionary restrictive. In this case, we can say that it's just the opposite. We can say reduce government purchases, or same way, increase taxes, which would reduce disposable income, and then consumption would go down. Both of these would have for effect to, first of all, mean that the government would have to borrow less, sell fewer bonds, or buy back bonds, that government debt would decrease, and both of these would have for effect to push the aggregate demand curve to the left. Aggregate demand would decrease. Incidentally, this is here we've got the curve would shift to the left side, and this is sometimes known as a modern term for it. I've seen this term now in the last 10 years or so, a policy of austerity. You might ask, why would the government do something like this? One, it could be because it's concerned that the economy is overheated. It's too much on the right-hand side of the long-run aggregate supply curve. But it could also happen when a government, in effect, is unable to apply an expansion. It has to, for a variety of reasons, pay down its debt. So it's buying back its bonds. So if we put these ideas together, we can have, for example, a negative shock or a restrictive fiscal policy, which would mean that the aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. And it could be going from point A to point C, or point A to B, putting it in the concept of, remember we had this inflationary gap, long-run gap, and the recessionary gap. Or you could have a positive shock or a expansionary fiscal policy in which the aggregate demand curve could, for example, start here at point C and move to point B. We'll be looking at this later to be able to understand under what circumstance a shock would push the curve either left or right, or the government, meaning the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, could choose to have an expansion or restrictive fiscal policy.